He filed a $1.6 million loan in my name using forged signatures, but one hidden deed exposed everything. Daniel and I bought our first rental property the year after we got married. It wasn't glamorous. A 2-bedroom on Birchwood Lane with oak hardwood floors that needed refinishing and a galley kitchen that was 3 decades out of style. But the bones were good, the neighborhood was stable, the school district was strong, and the street had the kind of quiet that attracts long-term tenants. We ran the numbers 6 different ways on a Saturday afternoon before we signed anything. We printed spreadsheets and spread them across the kitchen table and argued productively about vacancy assumptions and maintenance reserves. That was how we operated. Careful with the numbers, thoughtful with the decisions, in it together. The process itself, the hours of calculation, the arguments that weren't really arguments, the late coffee and the pile of papers, was the first time I understood that Daniel and I were going to be genuinely good partners. Not just good spouses, which I already believed, but good partners in the specific sense that matters when real money is involved. He trusted my numbers. I trusted his judgment on contractors and timelines. We each had a lane, and we stayed in our lanes, and the system worked. 3 years later, we picked up a second property across town, a 4-unit building this time, more complexity, more moving parts, but substantially better cash flow once it was stabilized. By that point, we had a real rhythm. Anna handles the books. Daniel handles the contractors, both signatures on anything that matters. It wasn't glamorous either, but it was ours, and we knew exactly what it was worth because I had tracked every dollar in and out from the day we closed. Marcus was Daniel's younger brother by 4 years. He had grown up watching Daniel make steady, careful decisions and had developed what I can only describe as a proprietary interest in those decisions, as though being in proximity to good judgment entitled him to a share of the outcome. He was charming in groups, funny at family dinners, quick with a compliment when there was an audience, and quick with a question about money when the audience thinned out. If you met him once, you liked him. If you knew him for 5 years, you started to notice the shape of things beneath the charm. His ambition wasn't the ambition of someone who wanted to build something. It was the ambition of someone who wanted access to something already built. He had invested a small amount into Birchwood early on, a 5% stake, formalized in a simple partnership agreement that Daniel drafted with our attorney at the time. The agreement was straightforward and limited. Marcus was a minority investor. He had no operational authority. He had no right to initiate financial transactions on behalf of the property. He received a proportional share of net income, and that was it. Marcus liked to describe this arrangement as co-owning the rental portfolio, which wasn't technically accurate by any measure, but also wasn't worth correcting at every family dinner. We had learned to let that particular framing pass. It felt like generosity at the time, giving him the language that made him feel included. I understand now that the way it felt wasn't an accident. He had understood, long before we did, that the family's desire to keep things smooth was a resource he could use. The first thing I can point to, the moment that in hindsight was the beginning of the whole sequence, was a spring afternoon in the 2nd year before everything unraveled. The Birchwood property needed an HVAC inspection. The system was aging, and a tenant had mentioned that one zone was cycling strangely. Daniel was finishing a large project at work. His schedule was locked. Marcus offered to handle it. He had a flexible schedule. He was familiar with the property. He knew where the equipment was. It made sense. We gave him the spare key from the lockbox, and we thanked him, and we moved on. He returned the key 6 weeks later. Not because we asked for it back. Not because he called ahead and said, "Hey, I still have this." He just showed up one Sunday afternoon with the key resting in his palm, said something vague about meaning to drop it off sooner, and handed it over with the same easy casualness he brought to everything. 6 weeks. I remember thinking it was odd. An HVAC check takes 2 hours, maybe 3 if there's a problem. 6 weeks is not an HVAC check. But Daniel seemed unbothered. It was his brother. The property was fine. What was I going to make a whole thing about? And I hadn't yet built the habit of trusting my own discomfort around Marcus the way I should have. I logged it somewhere in the back of my mind and let it go. That was the first boundary he treated like a suggestion. If I had the clarity then that I have now, I would have changed the lockbox code the same afternoon the key went out. I would have been cheerful about it. "Oh, we just rotated the codes, here's the new one," and Marcus would have had no reason to object and no opportunity to spend 6 weeks with unrestricted access to our property. But you don't have that clarity in the moment. In the moment, you have a brother-in-law who just did you a favor, a husband who doesn't want to make it into something, and a small, restless feeling in your stomach that you can't quite put a name to. What I know now is that Marcus had those 6 weeks to look at whatever he wanted to look at. He knew the property's layout. He knew the mechanical systems. He knew the unit was in good repair, the kind of meticulous good repair that makes a property attractive to a lender. He knew the neighborhood. He knew the tenant situation from conversation. Whether he was already planning something then, or whether those 6 weeks just planted a seed in ground that was already fertile, I can't say with certainty. What I can say is that when I eventually reconstructed the full timeline, the HVAC visit fell almost exactly at the beginning of it. The CPA calls started not long after. Our family CPA, Paul, had been handling Daniel's and my taxes for 3 years at that point. He's careful, experienced, and the kind of professional who doesn't volunteer information casually. He's also someone who, like many people, wants to keep the peace in an ambiguous situation. He wants to believe that someone calling with questions about a client's finances is probably asking for an innocent reason because the alternative requires an uncomfortable conversation that most people prefer to avoid. Marcus called Paul and framed his questions the way he framed everything, as natural curiosity. He'd say something like, "I'm just trying to get a better handle on how depreciation schedules work on a property with Daniel and Anna's profile. Can you walk me through the general mechanics?" Or, "I was reading about refinancing terms and I got curious about what income documentation typically looks like for a property like Birchwood at our size." The word "our" was always in there somewhere. Our property, our portfolio. A framing that implied an authority he didn't have, delivered so casually that Paul wasn't entirely sure he should push back. Paul mentioned one of these calls to Daniel in passing at some point, the way you mention something you assume your client already knows about. Daniel brought it up at dinner, casual, almost in passing himself. Marcus called Paul, he said. "Some questions about depreciation." I put my fork down. "Why is Marcus calling our CPA?" Daniel looked at me with the expression I had learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant he was deciding in real time whether to take my concern seriously or to smooth it over in the way his family had always smoothed things over. He's probably just curious. You know how he gets about the rental stuff. I did know. That was exactly the problem. I called Paul myself a few days later and asked him directly about the conversation. He was slightly uncomfortable, which told me what I needed to know before he said a word. The calls hadn't been general curiosity. Marcus had asked specifically about our rental income figures for both properties. He had asked about our depreciation schedules. He had asked what documentation a lender would typically require for a cash-out refinancing on a property with our assessed value and income profile. He had asked about income thresholds that would affect loan qualification, not general questions, specific ones, the specific questions of someone building a financial profile. I asked Paul not to share any further information with Marcus without checking with me first. He agreed immediately and without hesitation. I think he was relieved to have a clear instruction, because until that moment, he'd been left to manage an awkward situation on his own judgment. I'd just made it simple for him. I told Daniel that evening what Paul had told me. I laid it out plainly. Marcus had been calling our CPA and asking specific questions about our rental income and what documentation a lender would need to see. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he would talk to Marcus about it. I can't tell you whether that conversation ever happened. What I can tell you is that it made no difference if it did, because Marcus was no longer relying on Paul. He had found a better source, a source that required no phone calls and left no immediate trace. He had gone into the cloud folder. The shared cloud folder had been created in the early days of the Birchwood investment, back when we were sharing partnership documents with Marcus, and it made practical sense to have a shared space. Over time, as we added the 4-unit building and expanded the scope of the bookkeeping, the folder had grown considerably. It held income statements, expense logs, depreciation schedules, maintenance receipts organized by property and date, monthly and annual rental income summaries, my complete detailed bookkeeping records for both properties, the records I had spent years maintaining with the kind of precision that made our taxes simple and our decision-making clear. Marcus had been added to that folder years before. He had never been removed. It had simply never come up, one of those access permissions you set at the beginning of something and then forget to revisit. Because who audits a cloud folder when nothing seems to be going wrong? On a Tuesday night in March, or rather in the early hours of Wednesday morning, the access log recorded a download of 12 files at 2:14 a.m. The device was one I didn't recognize. Not my laptop, not Daniel's phone, not any device that had ever accessed that folder before. I didn't see this in March. I discovered it in August, when I went back through the log as part of what I was already reconstructing. But that 2:14 a.m. timestamp was the moment everything in my mind shifted from suspicion to documented evidence. He hadn't touched that folder in well over a year, and then, in the middle of a Tuesday night, he downloaded 12 files, not 1 or 2 out of idle curiosity. 12, a deliberate, organized selection that covered the income statements for both properties, the depreciation schedules, and the rental income summaries for the past 2 fiscal years. Exactly the financial documentation a lender would need to evaluate a refinancing application. I didn't raise my voice. I saved the file. I opened a new spreadsheet and started building a timeline. Every date I could document, every access and action, every conversation I could timestamp. I had understood something, somewhere in the preceding months, that I hadn't fully articulated to myself until that moment. The most powerful response to someone who is working quietly against you is to work more quietly against them. Marcus had been operating in the dark for months, but the dark has a record too, if you know where to look. The family dinner in May was where the shape became clearer. I hadn't yet seen the cloud log. I knew about the key, and I knew about the CPA calls, and those two things together had put me on a low-level alert, the kind you carry without being able to name it exactly. When Marcus mentioned, over pasta, with the casual delivery he brought to everything that actually mattered, that the rental portfolio might be worth refinancing, given where rates had moved, I heard it as a suggestion, an opinion, the kind of thing any co-investor might bring up at a family dinner. The assessed values on both properties have gone up significantly, he said, cutting a piece of bread. There's probably $1.5 million in equity sitting there that isn't working for anyone. A cash-out refinancing would let us redeploy that capital into something with better returns. He said us again. He always said us. Daniel said, that's worth looking at. We'd have to run the numbers. I said, we'd need to look at the terms carefully, and the timing, depending on where rates are going. Marcus nodded slowly, as though we were all in agreement about the general direction, even if not the specifics. Then he asked Daniel something about the weekend, and the conversation moved on. I thought about that dinner a lot afterward. Once I had the full picture, the cloud log, the hard inquiry, the submitted application, I understood that the conversation at dinner hadn't been a suggestion. It had been a test. He was calibrating. He wanted to see whether Daniel and I were open to the refinancing idea before he moved forward with what he was already planning. He wanted to know whether he would face resistance, and he was probing for it without ever disclosing what he actually had in motion. If we had said yes enthusiastically, he might have tried to bring us in and claim the application was a collaborative effort. When we said maybe, let's look at it carefully, he knew we weren't going to move fast enough for him, so he moved without us. The home deed for Birchwood was in its usual place, the fireproof box in our home office, alongside the deed for the 4-unit building. I had looked at both deeds dozens of times, mostly for mundane reasons, confirming a legal description for a tax document, double-checking an address for a lease agreement. But after that May dinner, I found myself thinking about the deed differently. It was something that couldn't be altered no matter what happened with whatever Marcus was building. The county recorder had stamped it. The notary had sealed it. Our names were on it exactly as they appeared on our identification, on the day we closed, years before Marcus developed an interest in the portfolio's equity. Whatever he was doing, the deed said what it had always said. That thought was a small comfort. I held on to it carefully. June was outwardly quiet, the kind of quiet that, in retrospect, you recognize as the quiet of things moving underground. I started checking the cloud folder's access log regularly, not the full audit I did in August, just a habit of glancing at recent activity whenever I had a reason to open the folder. Nothing in June, no new downloads from unrecognized devices. Marcus came to Daniel's birthday cookout and brought Sandra. He was his usual self, easy, funny, complimentary about the house, helpful with the cooler. Sandra brought a pie that was genuinely delicious. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that whatever was happening with Marcus, Sandra was completely apart from it. At some point during the cookout, Marcus found a moment to ask about the Birchwood tenant, whether the lease was coming up, whether we were planning to renew, what the renewal terms looked like. I told him the tenant had signed a 2-year renewal in April. Good tenant, on-time payments, takes care of the place. Marcus nodded. His expression was what I would describe as a controlled neutrality, the face of someone absorbing information they find useful while working to appear merely interested. I understood why later. A long-term tenant with a signed 2-year renewal and a history of on-time payments is exactly the occupancy profile a lender wants to see on an income-producing property. It reduces risk. It supports the income figures. It makes the property more fundable. He was filling in pieces of a financial picture, and he was doing it in conversations where asking about the tenant seemed like the most natural thing in the world for a co-investor to want to know. I want to be clear about something. I didn't know, in June, exactly what Marcus was doing. I had suspicions, I had documented some things, but I didn't yet have the full picture, and I was careful not to treat my suspicions as certainty before they were. That discipline, the discipline of not acting on a half-formed conclusion, was one of the things that made the eventual outcome as clean as it was. What I also didn't know in June was that Marcus had been running a second track entirely. Daniel told me about it one evening, a few weeks after the cookout. He mentioned it the way you mention something you're not sure how to categorize, carefully, watching my face while he said it. He told me that Marcus had brought up, more than once in private conversation, that Anna runs a tight ship, and that, in Marcus's usage, it wasn't a compliment. He had been framing my financial controls as excessive caution. He'd suggested that my approach to the portfolio was too conservative, that good opportunities were being passed over, that the properties weren't reaching their potential because of a bottleneck at the bookkeeping level. He had been saying this to Daniel, privately. In the conversations that happen between brothers when the wives aren't in the room. I let Daniel finish. Then I said, "And what did you tell him?" Daniel said, "I told him you're the reason we have equity to talk about." I told him that twice. I was glad, genuinely glad, and I told Daniel so. But I also understood what Marcus had been doing. He was running 2 operations simultaneously. He was building his case with the lender, acquiring my documents, altering the income figures, preparing to forge my signature, and at the same time, he was building a case with Daniel that Anna was an obstacle. If the refinancing had gone through without my knowledge, the leverage position would have given Marcus financial authority over assets he had never legitimately controlled, and if Daniel had come to believe, through months of carefully placed comments, that Anna was overly cautious and slow to act, well, that was a second kind of leverage, social leverage. The kind that's harder to document but just as corrosive. He was working both angles. The home deed in the fireproof box had nothing to say about any of this, of course, but I thought about it again that night. I thought about the recording date. 3 years earlier. Before Marcus had a financial interest in anything, before there was any equity to chase, before the property had become something worth lying about, the deed was the one document in the whole situation that no one could touch. Some doors don't close loudly, they close legally. The credit report came on a Thursday in August. I pulled it myself, the way I do periodically, the kind of habit that most people know they should have but almost no one keeps faithfully. I wasn't looking for anything specific. It was a Thursday, I had a few minutes, it was on my list. The hard inquiry from Coastal Heritage Bank stopped me. It was dated June 19th. I had never heard of Coastal Heritage Bank. I had never contacted any lender. I had never authorized a credit pull from any institution in connection with a refinancing application. I didn't call Daniel immediately. I know that might seem like the first impulse, but my instinct in that specific moment was to understand exactly what I was looking at before I involved anyone else. If I called Daniel, and he called Marcus, before I had the documentation in order, the situation would be uncontrollable within the hour. I needed to know what I had first. I opened the cloud folder's access log. This time, I went back to the beginning of the year. March 15th, 2:14 a.m., 12 files, unrecognized device. I printed the log. I opened each of the 12 downloaded files from their cloud copies. Then I opened my original ledger files, the ones I kept on a separate local drive, backed up weekly, with automatic timestamps generated by my accounting software every time a file was saved. I placed them side by side on my screen. The differences were precise and deliberate. The monthly rental income on Birchwood had been increased by $400 per month. The 4-unit building's income had been adjusted upward by $900 a month. The vacancy rate line had been removed. One significant maintenance expense had been deleted from the annual summary. Taken individually, each change was subtle. Taken together, they painted a financial picture that was meaningfully more attractive to a lender and completely false. I printed everything. The original files with their software timestamps, the cloud copies showing what had been submitted, the access log with the 2:14 a.m. entry. I put them in a stack and I sat with them for a moment. The text was sent at 11 p.m. The deed was dated 3 years earlier. I understood what I was looking at. Someone had taken my records, altered the income figures on both properties, and submitted a $1,600,000 refinancing application to Coastal Heritage Bank in my name, using my financial records as supporting documentation and, I would soon confirm, my signature on the co-borrower line. The home deed in the fireproof box was suddenly the most important document I owned. Not because anything about it had changed, it hadn't, but because it was the unalterable proof of what we had actually built, what was actually ours, and what couldn't be taken by a forged signature, or a manipulated spreadsheet, or a brother-in-law who had convinced himself that his 5% stake entitled him to the whole structure. I contacted Coastal Heritage Bank's general inquiry line the next morning. I explained calmly and specifically that I had found a hard inquiry on my credit report that I hadn't authorized, dated June 19th. The representative transferred me to the fraud department. The fraud representative confirmed that an application had been submitted under my name. She told me the application was still in processing. It hadn't yet been approved. That was the piece of information I needed. There was still time. I didn't ask for details about the application contents in that call. I took her name, the reference number she gave me, and I thanked her and hung up. Then I called my attorney. Ellen has handled our property transactions and the original partnership agreement. She's the kind of attorney who listens without interrupting, takes notes you never see her reference again, and then asks 1 or 2 questions that reframe the entire situation in a more useful direction. When I walked her through what I had found, the access log, the altered ledger files, the hard inquiry, the lender confirmation, she listened to all of it without speaking. Then she said, "You have the access log timestamped to an unrecognized device?" "Yes, down to the minute." And the original ledger files with software timestamps that predate the application by several months? Yes, the timestamps are automatic. The accounting software generates them on every save. I have the complete history. And Coastal Heritage confirmed the application exists and provided a reference number? Yes. There was a brief pause, the kind of pause that means someone is organizing a large amount of information into a clear sequence of steps. Okay, Ellen said, here is what we're going to do. The first step was a written forgery complaint filed directly with Coastal Heritage Bank's fraud department. Not a phone call. A written, signed, documented complaint that specified the nature of the forgery, the dates on which the records were accessed and altered, and the documentary evidence, originals, cloud copies, access logs, supporting each element of the complaint. Ellen drafted it, and I reviewed every line. I wanted to understand exactly what was being filed in my name before I signed it, which is honestly the lesson the whole situation had taught me in reverse. The second step was a concurrent complaint filed with the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. A forged signature on a mortgage application isn't only a civil matter, it carries criminal exposure. Filing with the AG's office creates an official record that exists independently of anything the lender might do internally, a record that neither the bank nor Marcus could quietly make disappear with a phone call or a revised application. I signed both complaints on a Friday afternoon, sitting at Ellen's conference table with the original deeds on the table between us. I had brought them along because they were part of the documentation package and because, honestly, I wanted them there. The deed for Birchwood Lane, the deed for the 4-unit building. 2 documents that said, clearly and permanently, exactly what was ours and exactly what was not. Ellen filed the complaints the following Monday morning. I told Daniel on Sunday night, the night before the filings. I had thought carefully about the timing. Part of me, the part that still believed in the straightforward version of marriage, wanted to tell him immediately, the same night I found the hard inquiry. But the practical part of me understood what would happen if I did. Daniel loves his brother. That love, I had already seen, was something Marcus had been actively working to his advantage as a strategic resource. If I told Daniel first and he called Marcus that Sunday night, Marcus would know I had found the inquiry before a single document had been filed. He could contact the lender. He could get ahead of it. He could begin constructing a counter-narrative in the hours I was still trying to document my own case. By Sunday, there was nothing left to protect. The documentation was complete. The complaints were drafted and ready to file in the morning. The sequence was locked. I could tell Daniel everything now without it changing any outcome except the one that mattered. He would not be blindsided. I sat down with him, and I walked him through everything from the beginning. The key. The 6 weeks it was gone, the CPA calls and what Paul had told me, the cloud folder log and the 2:14 a.m. download, the 12 files, the altered income figures, the hard inquiry, Coastal Heritage Bank, the fraud department reference number, Ellen's complaint drafts waiting for the Monday morning filing. I laid the home deed on the coffee table between us while I talked, the same way I had in Ellen's office. It was a reference point, the thing that hadn't changed, the center of gravity in a situation where almost everything else had been manipulated. Daniel looked at the deed, then he looked at me. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, he said, "He used your signature. He used my signature on a $1,600,000 application. He altered my bookkeeping records going back 2 years. He accessed the cloud folder at 2 a.m. without telling either of us. He did all of this without saying a single word to me or to you." Daniel was quiet again. I let him be quiet. You can't rush someone through the process of recalibrating their understanding of a person they have known their entire life. It's not a fast process, and it's not a comfortable one, and there's nothing you can do to make it gentler except not be in a hurry. After a while, he said, "I want to call him." I put my hand on his arm. "Ellen files tomorrow morning. Let's let the process work first. After that, you can call him if you want to." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he nodded. He understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. 11 business days after Ellen filed the complaints, Coastal Heritage Bank voided the $1,600,000 application. The written confirmation stated that the application had been flagged as fraudulent, that the borrower of record had filed a signed forgery complaint supported by documentary evidence, and that the submitted financial records didn't match the independently verifiable income documentation on the underlying properties. The loan was gone. I held the confirmation letter in my hands, and I sat with it. Not dramatically, not with any kind of speech to myself, just sat with it, the same way you sit with anything you worked carefully to earn. The cease and desist letter went out the following week. Ellen drafted it to be precise and thorough. Marcus was formally barred from participating in, initiating, directing, or facilitating any financial transaction involving the shared family assets, both properties, any further access to our cloud folder, any communication with Paul regarding our property finances, any contact with Coastal Heritage Bank or any other lender in connection with properties in which Daniel and Anna held title. The letter cited the forgery complaint, the AG filing, and the specific legal exposure Marcus had created for himself. It didn't dramatize, it didn't editorialize, it stated facts and stated a boundary. It went by certified mail, return receipt requested. Marcus didn't learn any of this from a phone call. He didn't learn it from Daniel showing up at his door. He didn't learn it from a family meeting with carefully managed emotions and an opportunity to explain himself. He learned it from the certified letter sitting on his kitchen counter, return receipt signed by his wife Sandra, dated the same week the loan closed for someone else. Sandra called me 3 days after the letter arrived. I had wondered if she would. She hadn't been part of what Marcus did. The 2:14 a.m. file download is not something you do with your spouse sitting next to you. And I had made a point, throughout the entire process, of not changing my treatment of her. She heard about her husband's fraud from a certified letter, the same as he did, and she called me because she didn't know what else to do. She sounded shaken. Not angry at me. Shaken. She said she hadn't known anything about an application or the cloud folder or the CPA calls. She said she thought when Marcus talked about the portfolio's potential, he meant something philosophical, that he was frustrated with the pace of things, not that he was building a fraudulent case to act without us. I believed her. The 2:14 a.m. timestamp is not something you do with your spouse in the room. I was gentle. I told her the legal matter was between Marcus, Coastal Heritage, and the relevant authorities, and that I had no animosity toward her personally. Both of those things were true. She thanked me. Then she said quietly, he kept saying the family needed to be smarter about the portfolio. I thought he just meant something different. We all assumed the best, I told her, and that was the last real conversation I had with anyone on that side of the situation. Paul, our CPA, blocked Marcus's number without being asked. He mentioned it to me in passing the next time we spoke, and he seemed slightly relieved to have done it, like he had been waiting for permission that he realized he didn't actually need. Daniel took a long time to find his equilibrium with all of it. Not with me, with his brother. That is its own process, separate from everything legal and financial, and I didn't try to manage it or hurry it. You can love someone your entire life and still have to look squarely at what they chose to do. The love doesn't disappear. It just stops doing the work of covering things up. Daniel had to hold both things at once, who Marcus had always been to him and who Marcus had revealed himself to be. There's no shortcut through that. He got there. He's still getting there, honestly. That kind of reckoning takes time, and I wasn't going to put a deadline on it. It might never fully resolve. The AG's Consumer Protection Division acknowledged receipt of the complaint and confirmed it was under active review. I filed what I had, I documented what I saw, and I handed it to the people whose job it is to determine what comes next. Marcus's 5% stake in the Birchwood property is now the subject of a formal process to dissolve the partnership agreement initiated by our attorney. It's not a fast process. It doesn't need to be fast. It needs to be done correctly. The thing about Marcus, and I have spent more time thinking about this than I expected to, is that he never believed he was committing fraud. I'm genuinely convinced of that. He had spent enough time around the properties, heard enough of our numbers, listened at enough dinners, to convince himself that the refinancing was the obviously correct move and that Anna's caution was the only thing standing between the family and a better outcome. He had rewritten his own motivation so thoroughly that by the time he downloaded those 12 files at 2:14 in the morning, he probably experienced it as stewardship rather than theft. That kind of self-deception is actually more dangerous than straightforward greed. Straightforward greed knows what it is. A person who has rewritten the story so that they are the hero doesn't stop, because stopping would require acknowledging a version of themselves they have no framework for. Marcus didn't stop at the key. He didn't stop at the CPA calls. He didn't stop at the cloud folder. He kept going until the certified letter made it impossible to keep going. He trusted in my not looking. That was the fundamental miscalculation. He trusted in the cloud folder sitting unaudited. He trusted in Daniel's affection making him reluctant to escalate. He trusted in the social calculus of family, where the person who documents and files and hires an attorney is often made to feel like the difficult one. He had done the math on those variables and concluded that the path was clear. He hadn't accounted for a Thursday in August when I pulled my credit report for no particular reason. The home deed for Birchwood is in the fireproof box. The one for the 4-unit building is next to it, same as it has always been. The cloud folder has been fully audited. Access has been revoked for anyone without an active operational role. The access log is something I check now, the way I check the smoke detector, not because I expect a fire, but because I have learned the cost of not looking. I didn't scream. I didn't send a late-night text full of accusations. I didn't call a family meeting and lay out my grievances in front of everyone over Sunday dinner. I built the documentation. I called the attorney. I let the legal mechanism do exactly what legal mechanisms exist to do. Marcus had 6 weeks with that spare key. I had 11 business days with the right documents. The application he built out of my records and my name is voided. His access to the shared cloud folder is revoked. His operational authority over the shared assets, the authority he had spent months acting as though he possessed, has been formally and legally removed. The partnership agreement is in the process of being dissolved. The deed still says what it has always said. I built something real with my husband over years of careful, methodical work. I kept the books. I tracked every dollar. I backed up every file. And when someone tried to take my name and attach it to their ambition without my knowledge, the same precision that built the portfolio was the thing that protected it. The key is not the problem. The entitlement is. The problem was never that Marcus borrowed a key to check on an HVAC unit. The problem was what that favor made him believe he was owed. He mistook every accommodation we made, out of family love, out of wanting to keep things easy, for a permission he had earned. The shared cloud folder wasn't an invitation. The CPA wasn't his CPA. The deed had never had his name on it. None of that stopped him because he had decided that proximity to what we built entitled him to a share of the decisions about what we built. I held a different view, and eventually I was the only one in the room with signed documents. And if stories like this remind you that boundaries are not cruelty, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes protecting your peace is the strongest thing you can do. Has anyone here discovered that a family member had access to your financial documents or property records without ever asking you directly? I would love to hear how you found out.